Welcome back to the Dionysus Circle podcast. My name is Dr. Sam Bennett, and today I'm sharing a conversation with philosopher Rareș Marinescu, fellow at University of Toronto. So we'll be discussing themes from his new book, Proclus on Aristotle on Plato, a case study on motion. So some of the key questions we talk about first is, how deep is the disagreement between Plato and Aristotle? Then how each understands the soul, especially in connection to motion. And then finally, whether the ultimate principle of reality should be identified with the one or instead with the intellect. I started the conversation by asking about his background, and I hope you enjoy the episode.
I grew up in Germany mostly, but I spent a big part of my education in the UK. So I did my undergrad in Germany, but then went for grad studies to Cambridge. And I first got into philosophy, I think as a teenager. I just started asking the usual big questions about reality and what exactly are we supposed to do? What about God? And, the classical questions. But I think in my case, it was also connected to studying Latin and Greek, because I was fortunate enough in school to have Latin, and there was also a small Greek program. So I got into that as well. And so pretty early on, I got to study or look at these questions from an ancient perspective as well. And I think that really put me then on track to studying ancient philosophy then as an undergraduate and graduate student.
A key theme in your work is the question of the harmony between the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, especially as that harmony is understood by Neoplatonists like Proclus. So the question is basically, how did certain figures, especially Neoplatonists in late antiquity, think about the compatibility between these two philosophers? Did they see Plato and Aristotle as fundamentally in agreement or as deeply opposed, right? And so that seems to be one of the key questions in your research. Would you agree with that kind of?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, definitely in my doctoral work and some of the articles that and of course the thesis that then came out as a book, as you've announced originally. I think, it was definitely about the origins of this harmony thesis. How does it actually play out? How does it play out specifically in the case of someone like Proclus, where, well, I think at least it doesn't play a very prominent role, or he's actually actively fighting against it.
Right. Yeah, and we'll get into that in a moment.
Exactly.
And so maybe just to kind of start things off in a simple way, maybe you could just talk a little bit about, how you would understand Neoplatonism as a philosophical movement, because, like we already indicated, we're going to be thinking about this whole question of the harmony between Aristotle and Plato from the perspective of Proclus. So what did Proclus think about the harmony between Aristotle and Plato? So could you maybe help situate that kind of discussion by just talking a little bit about what you take the Neoplatonism of Proclus to amount to? What does it mean for him to be a Neoplatonist in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, maybe let's start with the first part of the question. What exactly is Neoplatonism? I mean, it's a philosophical movement, starts in the 3rd century, and I think if we compare it with previous forms of Platonism, one thing that really sticks out is this principle of the one, which is the highest principle in their philosophical system. Everything is supposed to derive from it. Unlike their predecessors, unlike some of their predecessors, they're clearly monists, so they clearly believe that everything, all of reality, derives from one principle, not from two principles, which were obviously a type of one interpretation that was out there of Plato. You find it already in Aristotle's Testimonies, according to which Plato posits two highest principles. Anyway, so they think, okay, there's only one highest principle. So that's very important and quite different than some of the Middle Platonists, some people in the early academy. Another big difference or mark where they stand out is that this principle transcends being. So there are various ways in how we can understand that, but usually what they say is that the one is the source of being, is the source of all of reality ultimately, but it itself is not one of the things of which we can say that it is, just like a form of beauty is, or perhaps sensible things come to be. The one is neither of these. And because it doesn't, strictly speaking, exist, it also is not an object of thought, because only those things that exist can be an object of thought. And those things that, properly speaking, are, according to a Platonist, are, of course, the forms. And so these are the primary objects of knowledge. So the one really is not just beyond being, but also beyond knowledge. And is the one source of reality, the single source of reality. So I would say that's how Neoplatonism sticks out to other forms of Platonism that were before them, before the 3rd century, before Plotinus, the person that first systematizes Platonism in this way, and as it is later known as Neoplatonism. And then if we compare him with someone like Proclus, or we try to incorporate, contextualize Proclus within Neoplatonism, we see that he, of course, sticks to its main tenets, and he continues very much in an exegetical vein as well, of reading Plato and Aristotle. But what he's trying to do is he's trying to complete the system. So he takes over a system from his various predecessors, starting with Plotinus, but also his teacher Cyrenius, and he's trying to close certain gaps. So as I mentioned, a big part of Neoplatonism is deriving everything from the one. You have different levels then, and you have to figure out how many different levels are there really up until matter. Plotinus provides an answer, Proclus provides an answer, and Proclus's answer will include more levels and a higher degree of differentiation between them than in the case of Plotinus. So that's sort of what Proclus figures into this bigger picture.
Yeah, and just to anticipate there, because we'll be obviously talking about Aristotle a good bit in our conversation. It's interesting to think about how Aristotle also seemingly has an ultimate principle, but yeah, he wouldn't describe it as beyond being. I don't think he would describe it as beyond intellect. Again, yeah, he might say it's like, in some sense, the source of everything, although even there, some questions are going to arise for us. And then another kind of thing I was just thinking initially is there's also maybe a kind of hierarchy of being with Aristotle, like in terms of maybe an unmoved mover, then the celestial realm, and then kind of the sublunar realm. So there's a kind of hierarchy, but it's definitely does not seem to be quite as intricate, complicated as a more Neoplatonic hierarchy. But at any rate, yeah, we'll kind of get into a lot of those distinctions soon. Maybe now we can shift to a little bit more on that harmony question that we mentioned, which is really important. So you kind of mentioned in your work how there's different kinds of harmonies that the Neoplatonists were interested in. So one type of harmony that they were concerned with was like, how harmonious is Plato with respect to more of like the Greek theological tradition. So you can be thinking about like, the Chaldean oracles and things like that. But the one that we're really focused on is, the harmony or disharmony between Plato and Aristotle. And so, maybe one place to begin is, what would be some points in Aristotle where he appears most critical? What are some kind of like classic just instances to have on the table where it looks like Aristotle is, very critical of Plato, opposed to Plato? Because this is why I guess it would be a question about their harmony. So,
yeah, I would say an obvious place to start would be in Aristotle's metaphysics. Aristotle's metaphysics is supposed to deal also with his predecessors, and Aristotle is trying to extract as much useful knowledge that he can from them. I mean, obviously, from his perspective, useful. Ours might differ a bit. And there is specifically in the first book where he offers us an overview over his predecessors and what they said about the principles of reality and how they used them as causes. And obviously, he deals with Plato there. and he has one chapter, or at least for us, it's in modern editions, it's a chapter 9, and chapter 9 is an attack on Plato's theory of forms. Um, these attacks, these objections that you find there are in a very concise form, sometimes quite obscure. It's unclear what exactly he's targeting there. He definitely seems to refer to types of criticisms that were more generally prevalent. So some are so abbreviated that we might assume, well, the people that read it or were supposed to read it, they would kind of know, oh yeah, it's that it's the third man argument, right? We know what the third man argument is, or we have one interpretation of it. So if I tell you, oh, third man argument, say one sentence about it, oh yes, sure, it's a third man argument. I know what it's based on. You kind of find it in the Plato's Parmenides, or perhaps a version of it, and this is a way in which it could play out. So anyway, there's a number of criticisms there targeting the forms. What are the forms? Plato seems to say they're numbers. What does this even mean? Certain absurdities follow. What's the extent of the forms? Of what things are their forms? Right? And then certain absurdities follow according to Aristotle. Or it's things like how many forms are there even? And Plato seems to create more problems than he wants to solve. He wants to give us explanations of the things out there, but actually he comes up with more explanations and more problems that need further explanations. So that's some of the criticism that Aristotle puts forward there. So that's a very prominent place. Another prominent place would be De Anima, on the soul. And there he targets Plato's conception on the soul, and I've dedicated quite a lot of space to that in my book. And one obvious criticism there is, well, Plato says that the soul moves itself, but in fact, only things that are spatially extended can move. The soul is not spatially extended, therefore the soul doesn't move. Therefore, Plato's definition and conception of the soul is wrong and goes into a bad direction, and we should reject it. So these are two obvious places: theory of forms, conception of soul. Where
I was thinking,
Aristotle pretty clearly seems to disagree with Plato.
I was thinking, I think the most famous disagreement has to probably be the first one you mentioned, the theory of forms.
Yeah,
I was thinking, another a kind of famous one has to do with probably mathematical entities. Like, I think Aristotle kind of rejects the idea that mathematical objects are sort of separate.
Yeah.
But then you mentioned, the soul. There's some disagreements about the soul, and that's something we're going to get into. And then there's also going to be some disagreements about the first mover, which is connected to an agreement, which is that I think both Aristotle and Plato think that we need to explain the motion of bodies. Bodies are in motion, and this kind of needs a higher explanation. But great, yeah. So those are some of but those are some of the important. I guess the form of the good. I guess that would be another kind of one to think about in terms of a famous disagreement.
Yeah, absolutely. Which partly plays into his criticism of the theory of forms, but is also related to some other issues that perhaps there is no higher genus of the good. It's different issues that converge there, I think, yeah.
Good. And then really quickly, do you want to highlight anything where you think, hey, this is a really significant overlap, between Aristotle and Plato?
Yeah, I think Aristotle himself would agree that Plato is right in positing the existence of immaterial substances. So Aristotle looks at the history of philosophy, and he sees a number of people that think that only matter exists. And or let's put it this way, maybe not matter in the pure sense, but things made up of matter, constituted by matter, material beings. And obviously many pre-Socratics seem to hold that view, and they try to explain then reality as an interplay of different material constituents, where other immaterial qualities perhaps just supervene, come on top of them, but do not have like a separate existence. So Plato pretty clearly breaks with that tradition. He thinks there is something above matter that has a separate existence, and Aristotle picks that up. He picks it up. He does not follow Plato's view of seeing these immaterial substances as sort of separate universals, right? But he does think that there are separate immaterial substances that play a major role in accounting for sensible reality and the way sensible reality functions. He just happens to call those intellects. Of course, a number of differences then come up. But, from a more abstract level, do you accept immaterial substances or not? Plato and Aristotle would say yes, and Aristotle would agree that Plato said yes. He would not deny that, and he would say that there's a clear difference here between how I and Plato see reality and how these other pre-Socratics see reality.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah, so it's like, okay, he does reject separate universals. He does reject forms existing apart from particulars. So that type of immaterial substance, I guess he would reject. However, he does keep some sort of immaterial substances insofar as we have a separate intellect. Or we don't, but there exists a separate intellect. There's a kind of divine.
And perhaps multiple of these, right? Not just one.
Oh, right, yes. How many unmoved movers are there? And then anyway, and then and just in general, there's going to be these non-bodily causes of.
And if you look at the metaphysics, so if you look at Lambda 8, he's asking how many immaterial substances are there, and he then mentions the Platonists. Okay, the Platonists talk about immaterial substances, and they say there are. Well, actually, they don't really say how many there are, so there's a problem. But Aristotle, I can tell you how many there are, because famously, by considering astronomy, you can figure out how many spheres there are, and then you can figure out how many intellects must be connected to these spheres. So there, clearly, he seems to place himself as a successor of this tradition. Sure, he's superior. Sure, he considers of immaterial substances different, but he's part of this discourse to a certain degree.
That helps us understand why, the question of the harmony between Aristotle and Plato would be on the table for the Neoplatonists, why they would be concerned with this question, because on the one hand, we have, them butting heads. On the other hand, we have overlap. Okay, so, our focus is going to be on Proclus in a moment, but I just kind of wanted you really quick, like, do you want to just comment a little bit on Plotinus, like, in broad strokes, how would he, think about like the harmony between these two?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, earlier we have talked about what characterizes Neoplatonism, and I think another very important characteristic, of Neoplatonism that plays a major role in Plotinus, the founder of what we now call Neoplatonism, which he just saw as a revival and systematization of Plato's philosophy. An important characteristic of that is the importance attributed to Aristotle. So if you compare how Neoplatonism treat Aristotle with what the Middle Platonists are doing, so Platonists of the Imperial Age, the first 2 centuries AD, you will see that Aristotle plays a much more important role. Even if only as an object of criticism. But most often he's not an object of criticism. He's seen as a high authority, and you need to deal with what he has said. Whereas the Imperial Age Platonists would simply not attribute such an important role to Aristotle. Perhaps it's also connected that they simply don't have access to some of his writings, right? But clearly there's also methodological difference in approaching Aristotle between Imperial Age Platonists and the Neoplatonists, starting with Plotinus. So in Plotinus, we can see that he has read Aristotle very thoroughly. Every page almost has some engagement with Aristotle, implicitly, not explicitly, sometimes explicit as well. And he's a very important interlocutor for him right after Plato. You can see that. Nevertheless, Plotinus has a critical attitude towards Aristotle, and he introduces a certain attitude which pops up sometimes again in the Neoplatonist tradition, but most other later Neoplatonists would not follow him in this critical attitude that he has vis-a-vis Aristotle. So, in brief, what does he believe? Well, he definitely believes that Aristotle did not have a full insight into how the metaphysical hierarchy works. He definitely thinks deficiently of the highest principle. There are some problems there, and he thinks deficiently, especially about the 5 highest genera. So there are 3 Enneads, 6:1 to 3, where Plotinus deals quite critically with Aristotle's view on the highest genera of being. Plotinus famously thinks there are 5, taken over from the sophist, Plato's sophist, and he brings this in a critical discussion with Aristotle, who he thinks rejects them. And that, of course, has important consequences for how we see reality as a whole.
Right, yeah, and just for the listeners, like when you're talking about those middle imperial Platonists, that's Alcino.
Yeah, Alcinous, I think.
Alcinous, okay. Yeah, Plutarch. Yeah.
Numenius would be another important.
Yes, right, yeah. And then, Plotinus, coming after them. And then about 150 years after Plotinus is when we're getting Proclus. And yeah, I appreciate you highlighting. So already in Plotinus, there is, a concern about the highest principle, concern with Aristotle identifying the highest principle with intellect, which we will get into more in a moment. And so, I was thinking about this whole issue of the question of harmony, and it seems like, when addressing that question, there's different options on the table. Like one option is like, hey, look, there's a lot of apparent disagreement between Aristotle and Plato, but actually it's just surface level. It's just verbal, and then another option is like, yeah, there is genuine philosophical disagreement, but they're not about the fundamental things. And then the kind of the final position, which I think is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is going to be more Proclus's position, which is that, no, there really is a genuine philosophical disagreement. It's not just verbal. It's not just surface level. And that disagreement concerns really important stuff. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't read Aristotle. So anyway, so do you want to kind of talk a little bit about, Proclus? Would you agree with the way I just described it in your work?
Yeah, so I think how it works out in the tradition is that, as I said, Plotinus comes along, attributes great authority to Aristotle. We have to study Aristotle, but we don't necessarily have to agree with whatever Aristotle says. He's especially useful for natural philosophy, for instance, or logic. What then happens in the Platonist tradition is that the sort of second founder of Neoplatonism, if you want to use these terms, Iamblichus, comes along. So he's towards the end of the 3rd century, a generation or two after Plotinus. He is famous for shifting the interest of Platonism towards a more religious dimension. So that's one aspect. But he's also famous for introducing a certain curriculum, stabilizing a certain order in which the Platonic dialogues are supposed to be read, and also Aristotle's works, which are seen as preparatory for the study of Plato. And hand in hand, apparently, goes in a certain view of the role Aristotle plays. And that role is, again, like in Plotinus, yes, high authority, very important, but he's in agreement with Iamblichus. That's something that you don't really seem to find in Plotinus. I mean, Plotinus would say, of course, they're in agreement on some things, but not like on a fundamental, radical level necessarily, or that they're in agreement not just on a fundamental level, but on almost all issues concerning their philosophy. That's something that Iamblichus seems to claim, and that's something that then becomes very prominent in the later Neoplatonist tradition. So certainly during the time of Proclus, if we look at what's going on in the other big center of Neoplatonism, Alexandria. So they seem to be greatly inspired by this harmonist view. And Proclus seems to disagree with that. He seems to follow his his teacher, Cyrenus. And we don't have much left of Cyrenus' teachings, but we do have a commentary or parts of a commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics. And he comments there also on the last two books of the Metaphysics, which are very critical of various academic theories on forms and numbers and the identification of the two, which apparently Plato did. Cyrenus says they're very critical of what Aristotle is saying and very critical of Aristotle's philosophy in general. And Proclus seems to pick up this spirit. So he is definitely not one of those who thinks that they agree on the fundamental aspects, like Iamblichus would have said, but someone that thinks that there are fundamental differences between the two. Most importantly, Aristotle simply does not recognize the one as the highest principle, right? So Plotinus, all these Neoplatonists, they think that the one is the highest principle. They think that they get that out of Plato by reading the Parmenides more specifically, sort of metaphysically charged reading of the Parmenides. But there's obvious disagreement whether you find that then also in Aristotle. To be frank, it's not easy to find it in Aristotle. you quite have to force, I think, Aristotle to find the one as conceived by the Neoplatonists in the Aristotelian corpus. But it seems that some Neoplatonists who favor this fundamental agreement between Plato and Aristotle are able to find the one. Proclus does not think you can find the one in Aristotle, and neither does his teacher Cyrenus.
Yeah, so Iamblichus, like Plotinus, giving Aristotle a lot of authority, but treating him more fundamentally in agreement with Plato. And Proclus is not going to follow that harmonist tradition, even though that became a tradition. It became a tradition that other people followed. Other people were following.
It's the dominating paradigm, I think. Yeah,
that's the dominant. Okay, yeah. You just real quick, like this whole. It's super interesting, this whole distinction between the kind of Athenian school of Proclus's time versus the Alexandria school.
Yeah.
And I guess you kind of describe it as, the Alexandria school one. I don't know if there was other traits that distinguish them, but like it seems like one distinguishing trait was they were into this harmonist position, whereas it seems like the Athenian school was kind of
more critical, perhaps.
Yeah. Fascinating. And but would you agree that, like, okay, even though Proclus thinks there's this, because you can imagine a situation where you see a deep fundamental disagreement between Plato and Aristotle, and then you choose to say, and that's why we don't need to really read Aristotle. Whereas it seems like Proclus would not subscribe to that, right?
No. So, even though he might be more critical of Aristotle, and he might say that Aristotle got some things right, Aristotle didn't get the fullness of the truth, and Aristotle is partly even dangerous, right? Aristotle can be dangerous if you don't have the Platonic Platonist corrective there, right? So you should study Aristotle within a certain context and taught by certain teachers that can, if necessary, point out where the differences are, or they tell you, hey, you have to interpret it in this way, and then they're in agreement with each other. Proclus definitely thinks you should study Aristotle, no doubt about that. You just have to be aware that there are certain differences, and you should be aware that even though there are these differences, some of the differences can be solved. So if we consider the case of the first mover, and we'll talk about a bit about it more perhaps later, I think Proclus will say, yes, Aristotle and Plato have different views on the highest intellect, right? So the divine intellect, the separate intellect, they have different views on what exactly that's like, especially in the terms of its causality. Proclus seems to think that Aristotle's intellect is only a final cause, but not an efficient cause of the cosmos. But he thinks that if you take some of the stuff that Aristotle says about the causality of the first intellect, you can make it into an efficient cause. So even though Aristotle does not draw that conclusion, if you take his premises, you can make him, sort of force him to get to this conclusion that the highest intellect, the divine intellect, is also an efficient cause of reality. So that's a pretty interesting move, right? So you can read Aristotle, you get the impression, oh, it's only a final intellect, but actually here, I can explain to you that just look at these premises, draw out the conclusions. You're by yourself, sort of, knowing also Plato, and then actually, yeah, you have an efficient cause as well. So, it's fine.
Yeah, it's like he had all the premises there. Logically, he should have drawn this conclusion. He just
Yeah,
it was just a human error, but
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
like that's what was entailed by
yeah,
maybe
yeah.
by certain commitments. Good. And so at this point, we should maybe just kind of get into more of the details here, especially with respect to issues related to motion.
Yeah.
So that's gonna that's going to deal with like kind of the different types of motion. We're going to talk about that. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the connection between the soul and motion, and then finally, the role of the ultimate principle, and the ultimate source of motion in these two contexts. Now, I guess, I feel like it would be remiss, though, if we didn't kind of ask about what your opinion on kind of Lloyd Gerson's sort of approach to the relationship between Plato and Aristotle. Because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like he kind of thinks that they can be reconciled in a sort of straightforward way. We just, if Aristotle would grant that, like, the physical sciences are not explanatorily exhaustive, then maybe if you could grant that natural philosophy is not the deepest or final explanation of reality, then maybe we can do a kind of Platonic thing where we start appealing to higher non-physical principles. At any rate, I mean, it's a little bit tricky because it seems like there is a type of theology in, I think Aristotle calls it that. At any rate, but I just, really quick, we don't have to go too deep here, but, how much, what do you want to say about Gerson's kind of approach to this issue?
Yeah. I think when we look at what Gerson is trying to do, we have to differentiate between two different approaches to the question on the relationship of Plato and Aristotle. So we, as modern scholars, can just look at Plato and Aristotle, have a certain interpretation of Plato, a certain interpretation of Aristotle, and then see how those two can be brought together. And of course, we can interpret them in such a way as to make them more in agreement with each other, or in a way that makes them disagree more with each other. So you can definitely do that. That's one approach. The other approach is to see what do certain Platonists see, what do certain Platonists view as the relationship between the two. And these two don't necessarily need to go hand in hand. I think I deeply sympathize with the agreement that Gerson is trying to show between the two. But now, whether the Platonists themselves thought about it in the way he thinks about it is a different question. He often uses them as sources and as backing up his interpretation of their agreement. And I think there are some sources that are very helpful for that, especially Simplicius. Simplicius is a great harmonist. He really forces the issue, I think, on many points. So he's, for instance, someone that thinks that there is the one also in Aristotle, where Proclus clearly disagrees with. Um, and so I think what we have to do there is to have an awareness that some Platonists simply disagree with this fundamental harmony thesis. And I think Gerson sometimes, tends to perhaps lump them all together as being harmonists. And I think some are clearly not. Some clearly don't think that.
Great, that's helpful. Yeah, making that distinction there. Good. All right, so let's get into an area. I guess we could call it just kind of like the fundamental, fundamentals of a theory of motion, kinematics. And so I guess the kind of issues I'm thinking of, you cover this in a particular chapter in your book, but like the kind of issues I'm thinking of is like, there are certain kinds of motion, upward, downward, circular. They think that like circular motion is kind of the most important. It's like a special type of motion.
Yeah.
They're going to be in agreement about like there needs to be an explanation for all these bodies that are moving. There needs to be an explanation of movement. There's going to be this overlap about maybe. I don't know, time measuring change and what the nature of time on that level. Anyway, so you want to just talk about like this kind of initial level of agreement when it comes to, what you might call as like kinematics.
Yeah. So I think both Plato and Aristotle agree that there are different types of motion. And when we talk about motion, we don't just refer to locomotion. So the Greek term kinesis is a pretty wide term and refers definitely also, both would agree, to qualitative changes, such as from change of a color, for instance, right? From white to black or whatever, or you change the complexion of your skin because of the sun, right? Whatever. So that would be a qualitative change. Both agree that exists. Both agree that there are quantitative changes. You can change it. Things can change in size, diminution, and growth. And both, of course, agree that there's also something that can be called a substantial change. Things come to be and things perish, are destroyed. So both agree that exists. Both also seem to agree that circular motion is a special type of motion. Plato in Laws 10 calls it as a source of wonder and amazement. This seems to be also just a general objective statement of what the Greeks thought, so it doesn't seem to be specifically Platonic or Aristotelian. It's just quite amazing that circular motion does not seem to have a clear terminus and starting point, and it can go on into infinity, whereas it's more a doubt. It's more a matter of debate whether motion upwards or downwards can go into infinity unless, you have an infinite space. So that would be sort of the agreement. Another point of agreement would be in terms of causality, and that bodies cannot ultimately explain motion fully. So bodies themselves are in motion, they cause other bodies to move, but they are not the ultimate cause of that motion. So if you have a chain of movers, that chain of movers needs to end in something that is non-bodily. According to Plato, that must be the soul. Aristotle will then offer a criticism in Physics 8 where he shows that soul cannot be the ultimate cause of motion, but it would have to be something that is not embodied at all and does not have this relationship with the body. It has no relationship, in fact, with the body, one could say, and rather is completely separate from it, and that would be, of course, the separate divine intellect. That is then also further explained in Metaphysics 12.
Yeah.
So I think those are the two sides of the story. A lot of agreement, types of motion, causation of motion. But then if you zoom in and look at how exactly do they explain the causation of motion, you will see that one posits the soul as the origin of motion, that's Plato, and Aristotle posits the intellect as the source of motion. And then it's also a matter about how they conceive these sources exactly. So Plato would say that the soul causes motion by moving itself, which I think makes sense. So there's this thing that causes its own motion and therefore is able to cause the motion of other things. And Aristotle disagrees with that. He thinks that even if something causes its own motion, that is still part of a whole that is in itself in motion. So the soul,
Yeah.
even if you assume that there's a cosmos and it has a soul, it would be indirectly and accidentally moved by the whole and affected by it. And what we want is a cause that is completely unmoved and can guarantee the continuous motion of the whole. And that would be then the separate
Yeah.
intellect.
Yeah, maybe let's just real quick park on the whole this like foundational issue of like the idea that the something embodied, the bodily substances are not going to provide an explanation
Yeah.
for why there is bodily motion. And I guess when I think about that kind of thesis, I'm kind of like, all right, well, yeah, I mean, if I imagine stripping away the body from a body, all its desire, all its thought, anything living, yeah, it kind of just ends up being like this extended stuff. And it seems like the extended stuff is not going to explain why it starts moving. It can get pushed around, it can get pulled, it can get rearranged. But it's not going to initiate the motion itself as a bodily thing. So I guess that's just kind of like intuitively the sort of thing I think about there.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk at all about like Plato and Aristotle, why they felt like bodily motion is not self-explanatory, why we need something higher, and then we'll go into why Plato thought it
Yeah.
was the soul and stuff. But
Yeah, well, they think that bodies cannot ultimately initiate motion. So, yes, they can transmit motion. So, if something has initiated the motion of a body, that body, like in a chain reaction, it can
right.
transmit that motion. So, I kick a ball with my foot. And so, obviously, my foot is a body, the ball's a body, and that ball then hits a window, maybe destroys the window, whatever, sets in motion all sorts of other events. So obviously there's a chain of reaction, and the motion from my body, my foot, is then transmitted to the ball, transmitted to the window, transmitted to whatever then happens. But my foot, the movement of my foot, needs a further explanation, and they think that you cannot just keep going into infinity with this, because, well, you have an infinite regress, then you have a chain of movers that simply transmit motion but do not ultimately cause this motion in a sense of providing an explanation why it happened to begin with. So in the case of me kicking the ball, obviously one explanation would be that my soul has initiated this motion, right? Based on a decision or whatever, it decided to kick the ball, and then my body performs a certain action, namely my foot hits the ball. And so I think that's sort of how their thinking fundamentally goes, and that's why they think that just pointing towards bodies is just inconclusive and won't lead you very far, or will simply lead you into an infinite regress.
Right.
So we need
And so,
something else.
right. Yeah. So to stop the infinite regress,
Yeah.
Plato, I guess, is going to say soul, and
Yeah.
he's going to construe the soul as self-moving.
Yeah.
And I mean, it kind of makes sense that if the body is, if a particular body is going to get moved, the thing that moves it would presumably need to move, and through its own motion move the body that's going to get moved. So it kind of seems intuitive that the body that is going to get moved is going to be moved by something that is itself moving. And I guess the thought is in Plato is that it's going to be the soul, right? It's doing that. But then I guess it's tricky. Maybe we can talk a little bit about this, where it seems like Aristotle will want to say that the ultimate explanation of motion, is unmoved, which seems counterintuitive. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? Why he chooses something unmoved, and then how he thinks that could work? I guess it has to do with final causality, but
yeah. So specifically about Aristotle, I think there are different ways of trying to understand why Aristotle would posit ultimately as the source of motion something that is unmoved. I think partly it's definitely also on an observation, and this observation recurs in a number of times in his psychological treatises on animal motion and human motion. It's simply that animals seem to do things because they desire something. So desire seems to play an important, crucial role in explaining motion in things that are able to have desire and are ensouled, therefore.
right.
So what seems to be going on is that you want to drink something. What do? Well, you have an object of desire, that's the drink, the water, and then you need to do certain things to get to actually drink that water. So, for instance, you need to go to a well and then take out the water from the well, or you simply need to pick up a bottle of water. Now, the bottle of water might be 2 meters away of you. The bottle of water is not doing anything actually to causing you the motion, right? It's not actively pushing you to move. Nevertheless, you get up and you do something to get that bottle of water. And of course, the cases can be much more complicated. You need to get money to buy it, and you need to go to the store and whatever. So all sorts of things could happen, although the bottle of water is sitting peacefully a kilometer away in a store, not directly affecting you in any way. So this is like a very everyday example of how something seemingly unmoved manages to cause motion in us and manages to motivate to do all sorts of things. So I think Aristotle takes this everyday understanding, common sense understanding of how motion is caused. But he also offers us, of course, a very intricate explanation of that in Physics 8, where he's trying to show, as I've already alluded to, that the soul cannot be the ultimate cause of motion, and something that moves itself cannot be the ultimate cause of motion, because part of the reason there seems to be that it would be accidentally moved as well, and you want something that is not accidentally moved, you want something that is completely unmoved and causes that motion. And that's partly also connected to his larger theological views, where you simply don't want God to be bothered by the cosmos. So you don't want to involve God too much into the cosmic affairs. And so if you conceive then of God as something unmoved, well, that's great, because God is sort of cut off from the rest of what's going on. God is simply desired, but is not actively doing anything. And by being desired, he sets in process all sorts of things.
So does this also kind of connect? I guess this kind of connects to what they think the soul is. I mean,
Yeah.
For Plato, he does think self-motion is possible. It's a genuine possibility in motion. I guess there's a way in which Aristotle also thinks self-motion is possible, although it's like not
But in a different
strictly.
way.
Yeah. It's real, like, isn't it for him? It's like, yeah, it looks like self-motion, but really what it is like one part of the thing moving another part of the thing.
Yeah.
Isn't that kind of okay? Anyway, but and then there's going to be an idea that like self-motion is kind of the essence. It's actually kind of the essence or the nature of the soul in Plato, whereas in Aristotle, it's not going to be. I'm not sure what he would say is the essence of the soul, but at any rate, you want to talk anything about that element, that key disagreement about the essence, nature of the soul?
Yeah, so I think the disagreement about self-motion lies in a disagreement about whether it's possible for something to cause itself. So Plato seems to think that soul is able to cause itself and keeps itself in being. So the soul is what the medievals would call a causa sui, to some degree at least, because the essence of soul is self-motion. So the thing that keeps it in its being is its ability to move itself continuously without interruption. Aristotle seems to think that for causation there have to be two distinct parts. One thing has to act on another. You cannot have something that simultaneously acts on itself and is acted upon in the same respect. Of course, you can sort of try to touch your toes, and therefore you act on yourself. But well, it's you're acting on one aspect of you. Your hand is
You
acting
know,
on a
one
different
part to another, maybe.
part of you, exactly. So it's not to the same respect, and it's definitely two different parts. Uh, Now, Plato seems to think that in the case of the soul, it's the same thing acting upon the same thing in the same respect. There's no real difference there. I mean, conceptually, maybe you can come up with a difference, but certainly not in terms of the thing itself. Aristotle, as I said, rejects that. He thinks, no, there have to be two distinct parts. So yes, self-motion exists only insofar as the soul acts on the body, and then the compound of the two, the animal, including the human being, is a self-moving thing. But not each of the two parts of which it is constituted are self-moving. One, in fact, is unmoved, the soul, and the other one is moved, and that's self-motion. So I think that's there's the big disagreement there in the way they conceive of self-motion. And then Aristotle would simply say that soul's essence lies in ultimately allowing the body and the whole to function and to be alive, whereas Plato thinks that the soul is clearly autonomous and can survive on its own because it is alive on its own. It's not the thing itself that is alive. The compound itself of soul and body that is alive.
Yeah, and that's how it kind of enters into his argument for immortality.
Yeah,
Because the soul
exactly.
moves itself, it
Exactly.
never departs from itself, and therefore is
Yeah.
immortal, something like that. Now, um, one interesting kind of issue that kind of comes up in here pertaining to Proclus is how Proclus he appreciates Aristotle's refutation of the idea of a bodily or spatial soul. So, even though I guess the soul for Aristotle is like intimately connected with the body, on the other hand, Aristotle also has a criticism of the idea of the soul being spatially extended. And so what that means is for Proclus, he's going to have to give an account of self-motion, which is not just physical motion. Instead, it's like this some kind of immaterial motion, which is obviously a bit mysterious, but I think he connects it to reversion. At any rate, yeah, I mean, I guess I'd be curious to hear you talk a little bit about this whole issue of like the kind of interesting dance that Proclus is doing. On
Yeah.
the one hand, he's going to accept the criticism of the soul as being
Yeah.
extended. On the other hand, he wants to say, but it's still in motion because there's a non-physical kind. So
Yeah, so I think Proclus definitely takes Aristotle's criticism, namely that self-motion in the physical sense cannot exist. He takes it as a given, but nevertheless he thinks, well, we can still call that activity motion, whereas Aristotle would say, no, we can't call it motion. You can call it maybe, I don't know, energeia, if you want to talk about self-reflexive activity, thinking about the Aristotelian God, but it's certainly not kinesis, it's not motion. Proclus seems to allow for calling this activity motion. And he thinks that, of course, it's all grounded in Plato, and that Plato already thought that there are types of motion that are non-spatial and non-physical. including the activity of the soul. You can characterize it as kinesis, but it's unlike locomotion, for instance, or qualitative change or quantitative change. So Proclus has no problem with that. He thinks Aristotle rightly points it out. He just goes wrong. Aristotle goes wrong in not accepting that that's also a type of kinesis. So Aristotle's criticism is useful insofar as it has the right insight, but it's damaging insofar as the conclusion it reaches, that the activity of the soul is not kinesis. It's bad according to Proclus.
Fascinating. So you're trying to summarize where we've gone a little bit, just so that we can talk a little bit more about the kind of the ultimate being or not a being in the case of Neoplatonism. But once we get to the ultimate principle, we kind of want to shift to that now. But just to kind of summarize a little bit, we talked about, okay, bodies are moving. These bodies, there needs to be a source of that motion. We can't have a kind of infinite regress, so it looks like we're going to need like an explanation. And in Plato, it seems like the self-moving soul is going to be really crucial there. But now we can kind of think about this question of is a self-mover going to be ultimate? And even in Platonism, there's going to be something higher than a self-moving soul. And so basically, let's try to, that was my attempt to move into this discussion of the ultimate principle here. And so maybe we could talk a little bit about the type of causality that we have going on with the ultimate mover. So on the one hand, it seems like Plato wants to say that at least the demiurge is, which, Timaeus, is kind of a final cause, is something good, something we seek, but also efficient cause of the cosmos being. Whereas it seems like Aristotle might think that the unmoved mover is primarily a final cause, or at least maybe that's how Proclus would see it. So you want to talk about the type of causality going on?
So it's, I think there's a lot of debate in, obviously, scholarship on Plato, and a lot of debates among the Platonists about the role of the demiurge. But at some point, we have this view that the demiurge is an intellect primarily. Of course, that's based on the Timaeus. We have there the reference of nous versus ananke, and it obviously seems that the demiurge is thinking while he's doing these things, although it seems to be also discursive reasoning and not just contemplation. But that's besides the point. So this idea is being established that the demiurge is an intellect. And that's quite convenient because obviously then you can compare it to Aristotle's God, also an intellect. And one difference to which Proclus, but also other Platonists, Cyrenus as well, point to is that it seems that prima facie, at least, on a reading of Metaphysics Lambda, the divine intellect there is only a final cause. It's an object of desire. It causes motion, hos eromenon, right, as a thing that is loved, as a beloved. And I've explained how that could work out if you think about everyday examples such as the bottle of water, and that's an object of desire. Obviously, it's a bit more complex in the case of the intellect, but that's fundamentally how it works. Then obviously clashes with the Neoplatonist idea that the intellect isn't just a final cause, but the cosmos and all of reality proceeds from the intellect. Obviously, the intellect previously in an ontological sense, had proceeded from the one, but then all the rest will proceed through intellect as well. And one move there would be to say that even in Aristotle, the intellect is an efficient cause, because Aristotle says that all of reality, or the cosmos at least, depends on it. So what could this dependency be? It can't just be in terms of a final cause, but it must be in the sense of an efficient cause, in the sense of having been produced or be produced from the intellect. So that would be one way of making the two in agreement. But as I've already alluded to, Proclus doesn't think that. Proclus very much emphasizes this final cause reading of the divine intellect, and thinks that, yes, there might be already some premises there according to which the divine intellect is a cause of being and therefore an efficient cause, but Aristotle just doesn't spell them out. We have to force him to endorse that view.
Yeah, it's interesting because, intuitively, when especially after you give that example of the water bottle, it's like intuitively the sort of thing the final cause is going to be able to explain is motion.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing it's going to have the ability to explain. But like the fact that something exists in the first place, which can desire the good and then seek it, that
Yeah.
seems like it's going to be beyond a final cause
Yeah.
to explain, at least just the first blush. I'm not saying.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, the cosmos cannot function without motion. So there is no, if the cosmos stops moving, it's game over. The cosmos stops existing. So by causing motion, indirectly at least, if that's the only thing the unmoved mover does, it causes the existence of the universe. So that's a common move that you find among these authors, and that you also find later on in the medieval tradition, of course.
Yeah, and so it looks like you said, Proclus, he's going to take the route of kind of emphasizing that, the unmoved mover moves as something loved.
Yeah.
He's going to stress the final cause final cause reading of it. Good. And let's now maybe kind of talk a little bit about one versus intellect. So
yeah,
Plato, Proclus, they want to say the highest principle is the one beyond, which is even beyond intellect. And that the intellect itself, though, is a productive kind of cause of reality. Okay. In contrast, Aristotle is going to say the highest principle is an unmoved intellect. And so he doesn't have anything higher beyond that unmoved intellect. So, yeah, I mean, do you want to talk about I guess one thing to talk about here is, how big of an error does Proclus see that to be? I mean, because one thought is he just kind of, he just missed. There's one more level up. He should have just added this one level up. And obviously, it would be nice to talk about the reasons why Proclus would say you should add that extra level. But I mean, one thought is Aristotle. He just missed the highest level, but you could just add it, and then his system is much better. Or does I guess what I'm wondering is when Aristotle misses, according to the Neoplatonists, when he misses this higher one beyond the intellect, does that have significant ramifications for his system, all over? Or anyway, if you could speak to that.
I think Proclus does think that it has more serious ramifications, because it means that Aristotle construes wrongly some of the lower principles. So one issue that Proclus detects in Aristotle is that he misattributes certain properties to lower principles. So the primary object of desire, the ultimate cause of desire, is the one, is not the intellect, right? So the intellect is anything, if anything, it's a proximate cause of desire, but it can't be the ultimate cause of desire. And so when we speak about this famous conception that the Neoplatonists have of procession, all things proceed and return. Well, all things proceed from the one and return to the one, not to the intellect. Oh, things might proceed through the intellect and return through the intellect back to the one. Sure, fair enough. But it's not neither the starting point nor the end point there. And if you attribute certain properties to the intellect that the one should have, that's a major mistake. And so I think that's definitely an issue that Proclus detects there. Nevertheless, it doesn't mean that Aristotle's conception of the intellect is completely messed up. So he does detect correctly that the intellect thinks in a certain way that is distinct from our type of discursive thinking. So Aristotle is right in that the intellect contemplates. It's the type of theoria. It's not the type of dianoia that we have when we normally think about things in a temporal succession. So he's right in doing that. And he's also right in the sense that the Neoplatonists still think that you ascend to the one. So you don't start your system by starting with the one. There's, of course, a way of presenting your system in that way, but how your reasoning goes is it starts from the sensibles and then slowly moves up through the different layers of the metaphysical hierarchy. So, of course, some philosophers stop pretty early on, like the Stoics. That's quite bad for them from the Neoplatonist perspective. But Aristotle already got quite high, right? He made it to the second to last, penultimate layer there. So that's already very good. That's already very good. So there's reason for optimism there.
Yeah, that's helpful. You know, it's tricky. I don't know if you want to talk maybe a little bit about this. I think I'm sensitive to time here. I want to wrap up soon, but for those who are, let's say, theistically inclined today, they might have feel comfortable with saying that God, the ultimate, is a kind of intellect. And so, would you mind touching on a little bit of why? I think it has to do with simplicity, if I'm not mistaken. But why it is that the Neoplatonists were keen to say, no, we need a higher principle beyond intellect.
Yeah, I think unlike Aristotle, they are more concerned with unity and plurality. So, whatever worldview you take, you will probably be inspired by certain principles and oppositions. It could be being, non-being. It could be sensible, intelligible. All these, of course, feature in both Plato and Aristotle, and Platonist and Aristotelian thinking. But what really characterizes the Platonists is the opposition between unity and plurality. And plurality is often, of course, associated with matter, usually associated with matter, and unity. Well, unity, you need to find a cause for that. You need to posit that thing which has most unity. And that then ends up being the one. And then you have to draw all sorts of conclusions, because as it happens when you talk about things that are, usually there's some plurality already involved, or according to them, always a plurality involved. So things that are cannot be the something that is, right, could not be the ultimate cause of that unity. So I think if you see structure thinking along these lines, it becomes easier to understand why the Neoplatonists would end up with a principle that cannot be one of the beings simply because there's some plurality of already involved there, but it has to be something that transcends even this type of very basic plurality, compared, of course, to sensible reality. Um, and that is, of course, a type of thinking that then, you talked about, theologically inclined readers or listeners, that, of course, we then find in medieval philosophy in its different forms, be that, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, that obviously these people are quite interested in positing a principle that is simple, one, cause of unity as well. How, of course, you square that with scripture is then a different thing, where a lot of other things are attributed to it.
Right. Well, thanks so much for doing this interview, Raresh. I really appreciate it. And I recommend highly to everyone this book. I can Proclus on Aristotle, on Plato, a case study on motion. And it was published with Cambridge University Press. And so thanks so much for coming on again. And really quick, I'm just kind of curious, what are you working on now, if you don't mind sharing?
Well, speaking about theology, actually, I'm working on a short book to be published with also with Cambridge University Press in their Elements in Ancient Philosophy series on arguments for the existence of God. I'm there focusing on two specific arguments: the design argument, as we find it in the Stoics, and a form of the cosmological argument, as we find it in Proclus and the Platonist tradition. And I'm trying to approach them from a more, I don't want to say analytical modern perspective, but I'm trying to approach them from a more accessible angle than just quoting a lot of Greek and yeah.
That sounds awesome. Well, we look forward to that. And yeah, thanks again so much for coming on.
Thank you so much. This was amazing.